I brought my daughter to the hospital for her next round of chemo when the doctor stopped us and said, "Your child never had cancer." I glanced over at my daughter, who was clearly weak, bald, and thin after months of treatment, and told the new oncologist she had to be wrong. She turned her computer screen toward me. No tumors, no cancer cells, nothing. Not in today's scans or any previous test from the last 6 months. I felt the floor drop out from under me. "That's impossible, and look at her, and she's dying." The doctor frowned at the files. "Your original doctor is on leave and these records are incomplete, but there's never been a single cancer marker. What medications is she taking?" My daughter spoke up in her small voice. "Just vitamins." The doctor shook her head. "Vitamins wouldn't cause this. Bring me everything she consumes. Food, drinks, supplements, everything. I'm running extensive toxicology panels." She scribbled her number on a piece of paper. "Call me the second anything seems off." I left the hospital shaking as I looked at my little girl. If she doesn't have cancer, why was my daughter dying? I tore apart our medicine cabinet that night and brought everything to the doctor in 2 grocery bags. The tests revealed nothing unusual in the bottles themselves. But my daughter's blood work was showing mysterious toxin levels that shouldn't be there. So I started bringing in samples of meals we had at home. I was desperate. While waiting for more test results, I found myself scrolling through my wife's social media page, where she posted heartfelt videos of my daughter's journey to recovery. I was always thankful for the support she gave, especially the fundraising page that helped us a lot over the months. I continued scrolling through the comments, hoping the support would help keep my mind off of things when I noticed something strange. One person, a man named Dale, kept commenting on every single post with the same horrible messages. "Don't donate! This is a scam! Don't trust her!" And I thought, what kind of twisted person would do this on a cancer fundraising page? In my anger, I clicked on the profile. I sent him a message asking, "Dude, what's the big deal? Why are you leaving comments like this on my wife and child's page?" He responded almost instantly. "Your wife? Meet me tomorrow, at the McDonald's with the playground. Don't let her know." I went to the fast food restaurant alone and found Dale in the corner, staring out the window with hollow eyes. "Your daughter doesn't have cancer, does she?" he asked before I could even sit down in front of him. "How did you know?" "Because my Tommy never had it either." Then he pulled out his phone and showed me a picture of him, his son, and my wife, all smiling at the hospital. After Tommy died, I couldn't function. I was destroyed, but something kept bothering me about how fast everything happened at the end. So I paid for a private toxicology screening on some of his belongings I'd kept. Hair from his brush, baby teeth he'd lost during treatment. His hands were shaking. He was poisoned. And I found out too late. Before I could ask more questions, my phone rang. It was the doctor. I played the call on speaker. "Hello?" The toxicology results came back. "Your daughter has methotrexate and arsenic in her system. She's being systematically poisoned. We've cross-referenced it with everything you gave us, and we found traces in the cereal. Sir, please bring your daughter back to the hospital as soon as possible for treatment." Dale slammed his fist on the table when she hung up. "I knew it! I've been trying to warn people, but everyone thinks I'm just a grieving father who's lost his mind." He began tearing up. "She's a nurse, worked in pediatric oncology for 5 years before we met. She knew exactly what doses would cause the cancer symptoms." He leaned forward. "You need to catch her in the act. Set up cameras, document everything, get a video of her doing it. Without proof, she'll get away with it again, just like she did with Tommy." I rushed home and set up a hidden camera in the kitchen that streamed to my phone. The next morning, I pretended to leave for work, but parked down the street instead. I watched the feed as my wife poured cereal into my daughter's favorite bowl, then reached into the back of the cabinet and pulled out a prescription bottle hidden in a pack of sugar. She opened it carefully and crushed 2 white pills with a spoon before sprinkling it over the cereal and mixing it in with milk. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart," she called out in her sing-song voice. I ran back to the house and burst through the door just as my daughter was lifting the first spoonful to her mouth. I knocked the bowl from her hands and it shattered on the floor. My wife stared at me, and I watched her realize I knew. That's when the kitchen door slammed open. Dale stood there pointing a gun at my wife. "Hello, Susan," Dale said. Her eyes widened. "Dale? How did you find me? I've been waiting so long for this." I stepped forward. "Dale, we have the video now. Let the police handle this." He shook his head. "They didn't believe me when Tommy died. They won't believe you either. She's too smart." My wife pulled my daughter in front of her. "You won't shoot me in front of a child." "Watch me," Dale said, and took the safety off the gun. I threw myself at Dale from the side just as his finger started squeezing the trigger. The gun went off with a crack that made my ears ring, and I felt the heat of it pass near my head. Susan screamed and yanked my daughter behind the kitchen island, while Dale and I hit the floor hard. We rolled across the broken cereal bowl and I grabbed his wrist, trying to force the gun away from everyone. He was stronger than he looked, and we both grunted as we struggled, knocking over a chair that crashed against the counter. My daughter was crying, so hard behind the island that I could hear her gasping for breath between sobs. I managed to pin Dale's gun hand against the floor, but he used his other arm to shove at my face. The gun was still in his grip, and I knew if he got it pointed at anyone again, someone would die. I yelled at my daughter to run to the neighbor's house right now, my voice coming out harsh and desperate. She peeked around the edge of the island, her face wet with tears and her whole body shaking. For one awful second, she just stared at me and Dale wrestling on the floor, and I thought she was too scared to move. Then she bolted for the back door, her small feet slapping against the tile. I heard the door bang open and her sneakers pounding across the wooden deck and then the grass. Dale tried to twist under me to look where she went, and I used that moment to slam his hand against the floor again. The gun skittered away toward the refrigerator, and we both lunged for it at the same time. That's when I heard the sirens, faint at first, but getting louder fast, that rising and falling wail that meant police were coming. Dale heard them too, and his eyes went wide. I realized my phone must still be in my pocket from when I called 911 earlier, and it had stayed connected this whole time. They heard everything, the gun going off, the screaming, all of it. Dale stopped fighting and just lay there, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling where the bullet had punched a hole through the drywall. I scrambled away from him and grabbed the gun off the floor, holding it carefully by the grip even though my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely keep my fingers steady. Susan was still behind the island, and I could hear her crying too, making these high-pitched sounds like an animal caught in a trap. The sirens got so loud they had to be right outside, and then they cut off suddenly. Car doors slammed, and I heard boots running up the front walkway. The front door exploded inward, and police officers flooded into the house with their guns drawn, yelling commands so fast I couldn't process them all. I dropped Dale's gun immediately and put my hands up, shouting that I lived here and the gun wasn't mine. Dale already had his hands in the air and he wasn't moving at all, just kneeling on the floor with his head down. The officers kept yelling at both of us to get on the ground, and I did, pressing my face against the cold tile that still had milk and cereal stuck to it. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out, and I kept trying to tell them about my daughter, that she ran next door, that someone needed to check on her. An officer grabbed my arms and pulled them behind my back, but he was gentler than I expected. He helped me up to my knees while two other officers moved in on Dale with handcuffs. Another officer circled around the kitchen island toward Susan, his gun still pointed at her. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand even with the officer holding my arm. I kept asking if someone checked on my daughter next door, saying it over and over because I couldn't think about anything else. The officer holding me said something into his radio and then told me my daughter was okay. A female officer came through the back door a minute later and confirmed that my daughter was safe with the neighbors and a paramedic was checking her over right now. I felt my knees go weak with relief and the officer had to hold me up. Susan was handcuffed now and she was crying and talking fast, saying this was all a big misunderstanding. She kept saying Dale was crazy and broke into our house, that she didn't do anything wrong. Her voice had that same sweet tone she used when talking to our daughter, and it made me feel sick. The officers weren't listening to her explanations, and they moved her toward the front door still talking. More police kept arriving, and the house filled with people in uniforms, some taking pictures of the bullet hole in the ceiling and the broken bowl on the floor. Within 15 minutes, a detective showed up and took control of everything. He was calm and moved with this careful way, like he had all the time in the world, even though the house was full of chaos. Someone told me his name was Detective Dexter Townsend, and he asked me to show him the video evidence on my phone. Crime scene techs were photographing everything, and putting little yellow markers next to the gun in the cereal box. I pulled out my phone and my hands were still shaking so bad I almost dropped it twice trying to unlock it. I found the video file and played it for Dexter, holding the phone between us. He watched Susan pour the cereal, reach into the cabinet, pull out the hidden prescription bottle, crush the pills, sprinkle them over the cereal, and mix it all in with milk. His jaw got tight as he watched, and when it finished, he asked me to play it again. The second time through, he leaned in closer, and I could see his eyes tracking every movement Susan made. When it ended, he had a tech come over immediately and download the video file. They bagged my phone as evidence and gave me a receipt for it. Dexter walked me into the living room while they took Susan out to a squad car. I could see her through the front window, still crying and talking to the officers, even though they weren't responding. Dexter sat down across from me and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I started with the hospital appointment where the new doctor told me my daughter never had cancer. The words came out in a rush and I kept jumping around in the timeline, but Dexter just nodded and took notes and asked questions that helped me organize my thoughts. I told him about finding Dale's comments on Susan's social media, meeting him at McDonald's, learning about Tommy, the doctor calling with the toxicology results, setting up the hidden camera. Dexter wrote it all down and recorded the whole thing on a small device he set on the coffee table between us. When I got to the part about this morning and watching the video feed of Susan poisoning the cereal, his pen stopped moving, and he just looked at me for a long moment. I finished by describing how I ran back into the house and knocked the bowl away just before my daughter could eat it, and then Dale burst in with the gun. Dexter asked specific questions about Susan's nursing background and whether she had access to medications at work. I told him everything I knew, which wasn't much because she didn't talk about work very often. Through the window, I watched them put Dale in a different police car, and he wasn't fighting or resisting at all. Dexter saw me looking and told me Dale was arrested, but it was protective custody for now since he brought a gun and made threats. He said Dale would probably face charges for the weapon, but they understood why he did it. I watched Dale sit in the back of the car with his head down and his shoulders slumped. Dexter said Dale wasn't resisting and actually looked relieved as they led him away, like he had been carrying something heavy for way too long and finally got to put it down. An officer finally tells me I can go next door to check on my daughter, and I practically run out the front door and across the lawn. Mrs. Chen answers before I can even knock, and my daughter appears behind her and rushes into my arms, sobbing. I drop to my knees and hold her tight while she cries into my shoulder and her whole body shakes against me. Mrs. Chen is an older woman who lives alone, and she looks pretty shaken up herself with her hands trembling as she asks if we're all okay. I tell her yes and thank her for taking care of my daughter, and she just nods and says she's glad to help. My daughter won't let go of me and keeps asking what happened and where Mommy went, and I tell her everything is going to be okay now. The paramedic who checked her earlier comes over and asks if he can look at her again, and I nod while still holding her hand. He checks her pulse and looks at her eyes and listens to her breathing with his stethoscope. He tells me her vital signs are stable, but he really thinks we should go straight to the hospital for observation given what she's been through. I agree immediately without even thinking about it and scoop my daughter up even though she's getting too big to carry anymore. She buries her face in my neck and wraps her arms around me, and I can feel her tears soaking through my shirt collar. Mrs. Chen walks us to my car and helps me get my daughter buckled into the back seat and tells me to call her if we need anything at all. I drive to the hospital emergency room with my daughter asking questions the whole way about why we have to go back and if she's going to get more shots. I try to keep my voice calm and tell her the doctors just want to make sure she's feeling better and that they're going to help her. When we get to the emergency room, Dr. Sanford is already waiting for us at the entrance like he knew we were coming. He leads us straight back to a private room and immediately starts getting an IV ready while a nurse brings in bags of clear fluids. He explains they need to flush the toxins out of her system and start medications to fight the methotrexate and arsenic damage as quickly as possible. My daughter starts crying when she sees the needles and IV equipment and tries to hide behind me. She's terrified of all the needles and monitors after months of thinking she had cancer and going through so many tests. She keeps asking where Mommy is and why this is happening, and I don't know what to tell her yet. I can't just say that her mother was poisoning her because she's only 7 years old, and how do you explain something like that to a child? So I just hold her hand tight and promise she's going to feel better soon and that the doctors are going to take good care of her. Dr. Sanford is patient and gentle as he gets the IV started, and my daughter squeezes my hand so hard it hurts, but I don't pull away. The nurse hooks up the monitors and my daughter flinches every time one of them beeps or makes a sound. A woman in professional clothes comes into the room and introduces herself as Catherine Bishop from the hospital social work department. She asks if she can speak with me privately for a moment, and I look at my daughter who is finally starting to calm down a little. Catherine pulls me aside just outside the room where I can still see my daughter through the window. She explains that CPS has been notified about the situation and will be involved going forward. Her voice is gentle but firm when she tells me this is standard procedure when a child has been deliberately harmed by a parent. I feel my stomach drop because I know this means more interviews and investigations and people questioning everything. Catherine must see the look on my face because she quickly adds that this is to protect my daughter and make sure she's safe. She says a caseworker will come by tomorrow to talk to both of us and assess the situation. I nod and tell her I understand even though my head is spinning with everything that's happening. Back in the room, a nurse hands me a clipboard with consent forms for emergency treatment, and I try to focus on reading them. The words blur together as I try to process everything that just happened in the last 2 hours. My hands are shaking so badly that when I try to sign my name, it looks like a child's scribble all crooked and messy. Catherine notices and comes over to steady the clipboard for me so I can finish signing. She takes the forms and tells me she'll be checking in regularly and to let her know if we need anything. My daughter is lying in the hospital bed now with the IV in her arm, and she looks so small and scared. I pull a chair right up next to her bed and hold her other hand and tell her I'm not going anywhere. That evening, Detective Dexter comes back to the hospital to take a formal statement from me. He's carrying evidence bags, and I can see the cereal box and the prescription bottle inside them through the clear plastic. He found them in our kitchen cabinet exactly where Susan kept them hidden behind the sugar. Dexter sets up a small recording device on the table and asks me to start from the beginning and tell him everything. I walk him through the entire timeline, starting with the new oncologist's appointment, where she told me my daughter never had cancer. The words come out in a rush and I keep jumping around in the story, but Dexter just nods and takes notes. He asks me to slow down and go through it step by step, so I back up and start over. I tell him about the toxicology results and meeting Dale at McDonald's and learning about Tommy. I describe setting up the hidden camera and watching the video feed this morning of Susan crushing pills into the cereal. Dexter records everything and asks detailed questions about Susan's nursing background and whether she had access to medications at work. I tell him she worked in pediatric oncology for 5 years before we met, and that she knew exactly what drugs would cause cancer symptoms. He writes that down and asks more questions about how long the symptoms had been going on and what doctors we saw. When I finish, Dexter tells me Susan is being held without bail on attempted murder charges. The words hit me hard, even though I knew this was coming. He says Dale is in custody on weapons charges, but he's cooperating fully with the investigation. Dexter explains that the DA will want to meet with me tomorrow to discuss the case and what comes next. He says they have strong evidence with the video and the physical evidence and Dale's testimony about Tommy. I ask him what happens now, and he tells me to focus on my daughter's recovery and that they'll handle the legal side. Before he leaves, he gives me his card again and tells me to call him directly if I remember anything else or if anything seems off. That night, I try to sleep in the chair next to my daughter's hospital bed, but I keep jerking awake every time a monitor beeps. My daughter is restless and feverish from the treatment and keeps moving around under the blankets. I get up every few minutes to check on her and make sure she's still breathing. The nurses come in regularly to check her vital signs and adjust the IV, and each time they do, my daughter wakes up confused and scared. Around 3 in the morning, she finally falls into a deeper sleep, and I watch her chest rise and fall in the dim light from the monitors. I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing her and how I didn't see what Susan was doing right in front of me for months. The morning sun wakes me up through the hospital room blinds, and I realize I slept maybe 2 hours total. A woman in a gray suit knocks on the door frame and introduces herself as Priscilla Robertson from Child Protective Services. She pulls a chair next to mine and sets a folder on her lap while explaining she needs to interview me about what happened and make sure my daughter will be safe going forward. I nod, and she starts asking questions about our home life and Susan's behavior and how long the symptoms had been going on. I answer everything as honestly as I can and pull up the video on my phone showing Susan crushing pills into the cereal. Priscilla watches it twice and takes notes in her folder. She tells me she'll need to interview my daughter separately when she's feeling better, and my stomach twists into knots at the thought of strangers questioning her about this. Priscilla must see my face because she assures me a child psychologist will be present, and they'll be gentle. She closes her folder and says she'll be back tomorrow to check on us before leaving the room. Around noon, a hospital worker brings me to a small conference room where Assistant District Attorney Celia Sharma is waiting with files spread across the table. She's younger than I expected with sharp eyes, and she gets right to business laying out all the evidence they have so far. She explains that Susan's nursing background actually strengthens their case because it proves she knew exactly what she was doing and planned it carefully. Celia asks if I knew about Dale and his son Tommy before all this happened. I explain how I found Dale through the angry comments he kept leaving on Susan's fundraising page, and how we met at McDonald's where he told me about Tommy being poisoned too. Celia writes this down and says Dale's case will help establish a pattern that makes Susan's actions even worse in the eyes of the law. She tells me the trial won't happen for several months, but they have enough evidence to keep Susan locked up without bail. After the meeting, I go back to my daughter's room where Dr. Sanford is checking her monitors. He tells me the treatment is working and her toxin levels are dropping, but she'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, maybe longer. Her liver and kidney functions took a beating from months of poison, and they need to watch her closely to make sure there's no permanent damage. I thank him, and he pats my shoulder before leaving. I step into the hallway to call my boss and explain I won't be coming back to work for a while. He's understanding and tells me to take all the time I need, but I can hear the concern in his voice about how long I'll be gone. Money was already tight before all this, and now I have no idea how we'll pay the medical bills that keep piling up. I hang up and go back into the room where my daughter is starting to wake up. She looks around confused and asks where Mommy is. My chest feels heavy as I sit on the edge of her bed and try to figure out how to tell a child that her mother was slowly killing her. I explain as gently as I can that Mommy was making her sick, and that's why she has to stay in the hospital to get better. She stares at me with wide eyes full of confusion and something that looks like betrayal. She shakes her head and says, Mommy takes care of her and loves her and would never hurt her. I don't push it or argue because I know this is too much for her to understand right now. I just hold her while she cries and rocks back and forth asking for her mommy over and over. A nurse comes in to check on us but backs out quietly when she sees my daughter sobbing. It takes almost an hour before she finally exhausts herself and falls back asleep with tears still wet on her cheeks. My phone rings later that afternoon, and it's Detective Dexter calling with an update. He tells me they executed a search warrant on our house this morning and found more evidence that makes him sick to his stomach. Susan kept a journal hidden in the bedroom closet where she documented every symptom my daughter showed and how she adjusted the poison doses based on the results. They also found a second stash of medications hidden inside a box of tampons in the bathroom cabinet. Dexter's voice sounds disgusted as he describes reading Susan's notes about calculating the perfect amount to keep my daughter sick, but not kill her outright. He says they've sent everything to the forensic toxicologist for analysis, and he'll call me when they have more information. I thank him and hang up feeling nauseous at the thought of Susan writing down her plans like some kind of sick experiment. The next day, Dexter calls again to tell me the toxicologist Lucius Pendleton finished examining all the evidence. Lucius confirmed that the dosing pattern matches classic Munchausen by proxy, where a caregiver makes someone sick to get attention and sympathy. He found that Susan knew exactly what she was doing and carefully calibrated the poisoning to mimic cancer symptoms without killing my daughter too quickly. Lucius will testify at trial about how Susan used her medical knowledge to cause maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability for months. Dexter says this evidence combined with the video and Dale's testimony about Tommy makes their case extremely strong. I sit in the hospital chair after the call ends and watch my daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in months, and I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing her forever. I sit in the hospital chair after the call ends and watch my daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in months, and I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing her forever. 2 days later, my phone rings while I'm helping my daughter eat lunch in her hospital room. It's Dexter calling to tell me that someone from Dale's attorney's office wants to pass along a message. Dale wants to apologize for bringing the gun and putting my daughter in danger during the confrontation. I grip the phone harder and tell Dexter I'm not ready to talk to Dale yet because I'm still angry about how close he came to making everything worse. What if the gun had gone off differently? What if my daughter had been hit? What if everything had ended right there in our kitchen? Dexter says he understands and will let the attorney know, then asks how my daughter is doing. I tell him she's eating better today and the doctors are pleased with her progress. After we hang up, I look at my daughter picking at her mashed potatoes and realize I need to focus on her recovery instead of my anger at Dale. The next afternoon, Priscilla returns with a woman she introduces as Autumn Townsend, a child psychologist who works with CPS on cases involving trauma. Autumn has kind eyes and a gentle voice as she explains she needs to interview my daughter privately to assess her mental state and understanding of what happened. I don't want to leave my daughter alone, but Priscilla assures me this is standard procedure and necessary for the case. A nurse leads me to a waiting area down the hall, where I pace back and forth checking my watch every few minutes. The interview takes over an hour, and I wear a path in the linoleum floor walking from one end of the hallway to the other. Other families pass by giving me sympathetic looks, but I barely notice them because all I can think about is what my daughter is telling Autumn, and whether she's scared or confused or blaming herself somehow. Finally, the door opens and Autumn emerges looking serious and tired. She asks if we can speak privately and leads me to a small consultation room with a table and 2 chairs. Autumn sits across from me and folds her hands on the table before explaining that my daughter is showing signs of trauma bonding with Susan. She says children who are abused by their primary caregiver often struggle to understand that the person who hurt them is the same person they love and depend on. My daughter will need extensive therapy to process what happened and rebuild her sense of safety in the world. Autumn recommends weekly sessions for at least 6 months and possibly longer, depending on how my daughter responds to treatment. I ask if my daughter will be okay eventually, and Autumn says most children can recover with proper support, but the journey will take time and patience. Later that week, Catherine finds me in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee I haven't touched. She sits down across from me and pulls out a folder full of paperwork, explaining that she wants to help me apply for emergency financial assistance and crime victim compensation. The medical bills are already piling up, and I have no idea how I'm going to pay for everything on top of regular expenses. Catherine walks me through each form patiently, showing me where to sign and what documentation I need to provide. She assures me there are resources available for families in situations like ours, and that I shouldn't hesitate to ask for help. I'm overwhelmed by all the forms and legal language, but I fill them out as best I can while Catherine explains what each section means. She says the hospital has a financial assistance program that can help cover some of the costs, and the Victim Compensation Fund should provide additional support once the criminal case is resolved. That evening, my phone rings with a number I don't recognize from out of state. I answer and hear Susan's mother on the other end, her voice shaking as she tells me she just found out about the arrest. She says there must be some mistake because her daughter would never hurt anyone, especially not her own child. I feel my jaw clench as I tell her about the video evidence showing Susan poisoning the cereal and the toxicology reports confirming months of systematic poisoning. Susan's mother starts making excuses, saying maybe Susan was confused or didn't understand what she was doing. Maybe the medications got mixed up somehow. I can't listen to any more of her denial, and I tell her the facts are clear before hanging up. My hands are shaking with anger because I can't handle hearing someone defend Susan when my daughter almost died because of her actions. 3 weeks later, Celia calls with news from the grand jury proceedings. She sounds pleased as she tells me they indicted Susan on multiple counts, including attempted murder, child abuse, and fraud related to the fundraising page. The trial is set for 4 months out, which gives us time to prepare all the evidence and witness testimony. Celia explains that the delay also allows my daughter more time to heal before we have to put her through the stress of trial proceedings. Part of me wants this over with immediately, but another part is relieved we have time to build the strongest possible case. Celia assures me the evidence is solid, and she's confident about getting a conviction, but the waiting feels unbearable when I just want Susan held accountable for what she did. Over the next week, my daughter's condition slowly improves in ways that seem almost miraculous after months of decline. Her color returns to her cheeks, and her appetite comes back stronger each day. She asks for seconds at meals and actually finishes her plates instead of pushing food around. Dr. Sanford examines her during morning rounds and tells me he's cautiously optimistic about her progress. He warns that she'll need regular monitoring for possible long-term effects on her liver and kidneys from the prolonged poisoning. The damage might not show up for years and we'll need to stay vigilant about her health going forward. But seeing her sit up in bed coloring and actually smiling makes me feel hopeful for the first time since this nightmare began. A few days later, Dexter stops by the hospital with an envelope he says is from Dale. I take it reluctantly and wait until Dexter leaves before opening it. Inside is a handwritten letter where Dale apologizes for his actions and explains his grief over Tommy. He writes that he should have gone to police with his suspicions years ago, instead of just posting warnings online that no one believed. He says he got desperate and angry watching Susan get away with killing his son, and he couldn't let it happen again. The letter is raw and painful to read because I can feel his anguish in every word. Dale admits bringing the gun was wrong, and he's grateful no one got hurt because of his actions. He says he hopes my daughter recovers fully, and that I can forgive him someday for putting her in danger. I sit with the letter for 2 days before finally writing back. I tell Dale I'm not ready to forgive him for bringing the gun into my house and threatening violence in front of my daughter. But I acknowledge that he tried to warn people when no one else would listen, and his warnings ultimately helped me see the truth before it was too late. I write about my daughter's progress and how she's gaining weight and strength back each day. I thank him for helping me understand what Susan was doing, even though his methods were dangerous and wrong. I don't know if we'll ever be friends, but I recognize that he suffered a terrible loss and tried to prevent the same thing from happening to my family. I give the letter to Dexter to deliver and hope it brings Dale some small measure of peace. The following week, Priscilla completes her assessment and schedules a meeting to discuss her recommendations. She sits across from me in a conference room at the hospital and reviews her findings. Priscilla says she's recommending that I retain full custody with supervised visitation requirements if Susan is ever released from prison. She explains that I've demonstrated my ability to protect my daughter and respond appropriately to the crisis. Priscilla is confident in my parenting, but wants regular check-ins over the next year to monitor our situation and make sure my daughter continues to receive proper care and therapy. She'll file her report with the court, and it will become part of the custody proceedings that will happen alongside the criminal trial. I feel relief wash over me knowing that Priscilla supports keeping my daughter with me, because losing custody on top of everything else would destroy what's left of our family. The hospital started discharge planning 3 days later, after my daughter's test results showed enough improvement. Catherine met with me in a small conference room and spread out a stack of paperwork across the table. She explained that my daughter would need home health visits twice a week for the first month to monitor her recovery. I signed form after form while Catherine made phone calls to set up appointments with specialists. She scheduled follow-ups with a kidney doctor, a liver specialist, and a nutritionist who would help rebuild my daughter's strength. The appointments filled up the next 2 months on a calendar Catherine printed out for me. She highlighted each one in different colors and explained what tests would happen at each visit. I felt overwhelmed looking at all those colored boxes, but nodded and took notes on everything she said. Catherine also gave me emergency numbers and told me to call immediately if my daughter showed any signs of getting worse. Before we could leave the hospital, Autumn stopped by the room with a folder full of papers. She sat down on the edge of my daughter's bed and talked to me about what came next. Autumn explained that my daughter would need ongoing therapy to process what happened and that trauma shows up in different ways for kids. She gave me a list of warning signs to watch for, like nightmares, changes in eating, being scared of certain places or people, and acting younger than her age. Autumn recommended weekly therapy sessions and said my daughter should see someone who works specifically with kids who went through medical trauma. She also suggested I get counseling for myself because watching your child almost die leaves marks too. I promised I would look into it, but honestly, I was just focused on getting my daughter home and keeping her safe. Catherine came back with discharge instructions and helped us pack up the few things we had in the room. My daughter was quiet as we walked out to the car, holding tight to my hand. The drive home felt strange after spending so much time at the hospital. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the front door looked normal, but my hands shook putting the key in the lock. Inside, everything was clean. Too clean. The crime scene people had removed all the broken glass and wiped down the kitchen. But when I looked up, I could see the bullet hole in the ceiling right above where Dale had been standing. My daughter saw it too and stopped walking. I tried to block her view, but she had already seen it and her face went pale. I told her we didn't have to stay here long and started thinking about how fast I could find us a new place. This house had too many bad memories now. Every room reminded me of what Susan did and how close we came to losing everything. I decided right then that we needed to move as soon as possible. My daughter followed me from room to room as I checked to make sure everything was okay. She wouldn't let me out of her sight, not even for a second. When I went to the bathroom, she stood outside the door. When I went to get something from my bedroom, she came with me. At dinner time, I made simple pasta, but she stared at her plate without eating. She asked if the food was safe, and I realized she was scared I might poison her too. I had to show her every ingredient, let her watch me open each package, and let her see me cook everything. Even then, she only ate a few bites. The next morning, Dexter called while I was making breakfast. He told me that Susan's old employer at the pediatric ward finally got back to him with information. They confirmed Susan was asked to resign 3 years ago after concerns came up about her behavior with patients. Dexter said the hospital wouldn't give him details at first, but eventually admitted there were complaints from other nurses about Susan spending too much time with certain sick kids. Nothing was formally documented or reported to any authorities. They just let her quietly leave. I felt anger burn through me as Dexter talked. The hospital let her walk away instead of investigating what she was doing. If they had looked into it, they might have figured out what happened to Tommy. They might have stopped her before she got to my daughter. Dexter said they were looking into whether the hospital could be held responsible, but his main focus was building the criminal case against Susan. He told me not to contact the hospital directly because it could mess up the investigation. A week later, Celia called and asked me to come to her office to prepare for trial. I left my daughter with Mrs. M. Chen next door and drove downtown. Celia's office was small and packed with file boxes. She cleared off a chair for me and explained that I would need to testify about everything I witnessed and discovered. We spent 3 hours going over my testimony. Celia asked me questions and I practiced answering them. She coached me on how to stay calm and stick to the facts when I was on the witness stand. She warned me that Susan's lawyer would try to make me seem unreliable or confused. We practiced over and over until I could tell the story without getting too emotional. Celia said the video evidence was strong, but my testimony would help the jury understand the full picture of what Susan did. That same week, Dexter stopped by to tell me Dale had accepted a plea deal. Dale got probation and mandatory counseling in exchange for testifying against Susan. Dexter said Dale was sorry about bringing the gun and had been helping them build the case. Dale gave them details about Tommy's case that showed a clear pattern in how Susan operated. The information Dale provided made the evidence against Susan even stronger. I still felt conflicted about Dale, but I understood he was trying to make things right. 2 weeks after coming home from the hospital, my daughter had her first therapy appointment with Autumn. I drove her to the office and sat in the waiting room feeling nervous. The session lasted almost an hour, and I kept checking my watch. When the door finally opened, my daughter came out looking tired but okay. Autumn walked her to me and gave me a small nod that seemed encouraging. She scheduled another appointment for the following week. On the drive home, my daughter was quiet, but she held my hand. Meanwhile, medical bills started arriving in the mail. Thick envelopes came every few days with charges for emergency treatment, hospital stays, tests, and medications. I used up all my sick leave and vacation time from work. The fundraising money Susan collected was frozen as evidence, so I couldn't access it to pay anything. I had to apply for public assistance just to keep us going. I filled out forms for food stamps and medical payment plans. The financial stress added to everything else we were dealing with. I lay awake at night doing math in my head, trying to figure out how we would make it through the next few months. Weeks later, Celia called to tell me the trial date was set for 2 months out, and I needed to be ready. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. I took my daughter to therapy twice a week and watched her slowly start to trust again. She asked questions about the trial, and I tried to explain it in ways she could understand without scaring her more. The day the trial started, I dropped her off at Mrs. Chen's house and drove to the courthouse with my hands shaking on the wheel. The courtroom was smaller than I expected and filled with people I didn't know. I sat behind Celia at the prosecutor's table and tried to breathe normally. The jury selection took 2 days, and then the trial actually began. Celia presented the video evidence first, and the courtroom went silent as everyone watched Susan crush those pills and mix them into the cereal. Several jurors looked sick. Then came the medical testimony about the poisoning and what it did to my daughter's body. Dr. Sanford explained the organ damage and the months of unnecessary suffering. I had to leave the courtroom twice because I couldn't handle hearing the details again. On the 3rd day, Dale took the stand. He wore a suit that looked too big on him, and his hands trembled as he was sworn in. Celia asked him about Tommy, and Dale's voice cracked as he described his son's final days. He talked about the hair loss and weakness, and how Tommy had begged him to make the pain stop. The jury looked horrified. Dale explained how he discovered the poisoning too late, and how he tried to warn people about Susan, but nobody believed him. Then Lucius took the stand and walked the jury through the toxicology evidence. He used charts and diagrams to show how Susan used her medical knowledge to cause maximum suffering while keeping everything looking like cancer symptoms. He explained that the dosing pattern showed careful planning and that Susan knew exactly what she was doing. The jury members were taking notes and several looked angry. On the 4th day, Susan took the stand against Fletcher's advice. I could see him trying to stop her, but she insisted. She wore a simple dress and kept her voice soft as she testified. She claimed she only wanted to help her daughter and things got out of control. She said she didn't mean for it to go so far. But her testimony came across cold and calculated. She showed no real emotion and kept making excuses. I watched the jury and could see they weren't buying it. One woman in the front row was shaking her head. When Celia cross-examined Susan, she tore apart every excuse. Susan got defensive and her mask slipped. By the end, everyone could see through her act. The jury got the case after closing arguments, and I went home to wait. 6 hours later, Celia called and told me to get back to the courthouse. The jury had reached a verdict. I drove back with my stomach in knots. We all stood as the jury filed back in. The forewoman handed the verdict forms to the judge. He read each count out loud. Guilty on attempted murder. Guilty on child abuse. Guilty on fraud. Guilty on all counts. Susan showed no emotion at all as the verdicts were read. She just sat there staring straight ahead like none of it mattered. But I felt something lift from my chest. She would be held accountable. Fletcher asked for bail pending sentencing, but the judge denied it. Susan was led away in handcuffs, and I finally let myself breathe. 3 weeks later, we were back for sentencing. Celia had me prepare a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium and read from my notes about how the poisoning affected my daughter's physical and mental health. I described the hospital stays and the fear and the nightmares she still has. I talked about how she flinches when I hand her food and asks if it's safe to eat. My voice shook, but I got through it. The judge listened carefully and took notes. Then he announced the sentence. 25 years in prison with mandatory mental health treatment. Permanent loss of nursing license. No contact with my daughter ever. Susan still showed no reaction. She was led away, and I knew it was finally over. After the sentencing, I picked up my daughter from Mrs. Chen's and we drove to the park. We sat on the swings together and she asked if we were safe now. I promised her we were. I told her Mommy couldn't hurt her anymore and I would always protect her. She held my hand and we swung together in silence. 6 months after the poisoning stopped, my daughter's hair started growing back in soft curls. She gained weight and her color returned. The doctor said her organs were healing well. She still had nightmares sometimes and needed routines that made her feel secure. But Autumn said she was making remarkable progress. She was learning to be a kid again. I got promoted at work with a raise that helped us get back on our feet. My boss had been incredibly supportive through everything. The crime victim compensation covered most of the medical bills. We were building a new normal that felt genuinely hopeful. My daughter and I created new traditions in our apartment. Friday movie nights where she picked the film. Sunday morning pancakes where she helped me cook. Bedtime stories where she was always the hero who saved the day. She was learning to trust again. Watching her laugh and play like a normal kid filled me with gratitude that we caught this in time and she had her whole life ahead of her.